I've indirectly had to deal with the question in several previous videos of why I don't think it's a good idea to call somebody God or a god. I've recently found another YouTuber who has a similar problem. She wants to not identify as Pan and is apparently under considerable pressure from her viewers to do so. There's this tendency of people who have an identity that's symbolized by a letter of an increasingly long list of letters to not identify as only one letter in the list, but all of them, take in an entire chunk of the alphabet. And this, I think, may be part of this push of promotion of the Greek deity Pan. Because his name, Pan, is the root of the prefix meaning all, in that he was approved of by at least multiple Greek gods, or all, depending on the version of the myth you read. But he's being promoted in this distracting way, as far as I can see, because people get into all sorts of questions about definitions and how you define your identity. But the primary characteristic of Pan that I don't find appealing is that, according to some sources at least, he's the only Greek god who's dead. So when being pressured to identify with or exemplify the characteristics of the god Pan, the recipient is also being asked to identify with a dead god, when it would seem to me the primary purpose of being a god, the number one thing I would want, which overlaps with the characteristics of gods, would be to be young and healthy and not die. Now, this is not the same as being a god in various traditions. In Christianity, the ultimate goal of people after the resurrection, when everything is good, is to live eternally and be healthy. It's not to actually be a god. So being healthy indefinitely and young, I presume, is not the same thing as being a god. There are also people who perform miracles or do supernatural things, like in Peter's case, raising someone from the dead, or in Moses' case, various miraculous magical things, and yet they are not identified as gods. As I've said in one previous video, there is one easy to distinguish characteristic which separates people from gods in what is otherwise a very confusing scheme of how you define the difference. And that is that people sing and gods don't. So it doesn't make any sense to compliment somebody as a god when, at least in biblical terms, that's the number one thing that differentiates from humans to gods, in that humans sing, gods don't. So I've had this discussion come up several times, and I've thought many times there ought to be a central place where I can collect these reasons or have a discussion on why people want to call somebody a god. I don't like it because it's very vague. There are all sorts of individual reasons, I think, because I asked in one case, why would you use this term? And the person responding had a very specific reason for calling somebody a god, which I presume would differ a lot from other people's very specific reasons. And when you use the term, you muddy the waters and make it more difficult for other people to understand you, and more likely they will misunderstand and possibly take offense. So someone may have a very specific meaning in mind, which no one else learns, or they may have a very vague meaning in mind, having a general sense of wanting to compliment someone and not knowing how to do it. Nevertheless, I would like to know that. If you say, I want to compliment you somehow, I don't know how to do it, say that, by all means. That would help as feedback. I also want the channel to be open to people who want to learn things about the Bible that are in the Bible but have been changed through intermediaries, and I think the intermediaries aren't telling what's in the original text. So therefore, I don't want the channel to be closed off to people of Abrahamic faiths. And the Ten Commandments are explicit in Judaism and Christianity, and at least partially adopted by Islam. So one of the main things you do in Ten Commandments, perhaps the main thing, is not call somebody to a god. It's the most offensive thing you can possibly do, I think, in terms of creating the greatest number of offenses with the smallest possible number of words. Calling someone a god, as far as I can tell, quite directly could be considered a violation of 6 of the Ten Commandments. And there's an interpretation I've just read in which the person says that the commandments are meant to be read out in pairs. So apparently unrelated ones are actually connected. So if you violate one, you violate the other. And by that precept, calling somebody a god would virtually violate the whole list all at once. So I don't want people to see someone calling me a god on a channel, me not calling them out, and taking offense because I'm not fighting back against it. Of course, there's difficulties with this too. There's a Garden of Eden problem. When you tell people, don't call me a god, then they're probably more likely to do it. Nevertheless, don't want to be identified that way because of the tie-in, it seems to me, of this general push to connect godhood with death. In that the term is most widely promoted in the pan sense to promote death, people not wanting to live. And my purpose for having the YouTube channel is, of course, the opposite. I'm hoping to take down people's barriers to being young and healthy so that we can have a society where at least those choosing to live can do so.